Hello everybody, Yakri here with another Warframe video, and this time we're going to look at beam weapons again! And that's because DE has released a new update in which there were more significant changes to how beam weapons work, and I am a huge fan of this one. So first off, let's take a look at the synapse. It's a good way to illustrate these changes, I think, overall. Let's see, you've got corrosive and what do I want here? I want I'm going to try to get rid of the ribbon. We're going to put in some Stormbringer into here. Actually, wait, better Stormbringer. There we go. We got Stormbringer in here, and there's no ribbon, no sweet ribbon mod to massively boost the damage. Let's take a look at how much damage this weapon can do. So, in particular, we're going to look at the ramp up, how ramp up worked for beam weapons, right? Because they've changed it. Now, if you remember from my previous videos or have been keeping up to date on the game, beam weapons had a 1 second per enemy ramp up, right? As in they start at 10% of their damage and ramp up to 100% of their damage over the course of 1 second. This has been changed. Now beam weapons start at 20% of their base damage and ramp up to 100% of their base damage over 0.6 seconds. So it's much faster per enemy. If you're killing 3 enemies, it's not going to be 3 seconds ramping up, and not as much of the time spent ramping up is going to be spent at 10% damage, right? Because of course you're at 20% base now. Instead, you've got that 0.6 seconds, so that's going to be 1.8 seconds for 3 enemies instead of 3 seconds. So that is a substantial buff to beam weapons. Particularly, it's a substantial buff to weapons like the Synapse, which have to fire at 1 enemy at a time, right? Maybe 2 if you equip punch through mods, which you probably should, and hit 2 enemies at once, right? And there has been another change. Enemies, if you stopped shooting the same enemy, right? If you shot this guy and then shot off, right? You would instantly lose all the damage that you'd ramped up to, right? You'd go back to 10% of your base damage. This is no longer the case. Now, after 0.8 seconds, the damage ramp up begins decaying over 2 seconds. So it ramps back down from 100% to 20% over the course of 2 seconds, meaning that it takes 2.8 seconds in total for your damage to ramp down. This is pretty substantial in addition to the very fast ramp up. So let's take a look at how this works. So we fire, and you can quickly see me hit up to this is about where we're doing max damage, right? I can kind of go on and off, and my damage actually keeps going up rather than going back down because I'm getting corrosive procs, right? And previously you would have actually seen, even with the corrosive procs, you would have seen damage fall off, right? And that's because it would go down to 10% of previous damage, and it would really negate that benefit, right? And now if you quickly aim on and off of an enemy, you aren't going to lose any damage at all, right? Because it takes 0.8 seconds before the ramp down even starts. All right, and with the faster ramp up, you can really easily kill enemies that are within the capabilities of your weapon in a short period of time. And the actual number of enemies you can kill in an ammo clip has been brought up substantially, and it makes it feel, especially with the 20% base increase, it makes these weapons feel a lot less shitty versus low-level enemies, right? Because I did one video where I was talking about how, like, if you actually have to dodge around versus enemies that aren't like crazy high level, and you have to aim while doing that, so you're not getting like really consistent hits. You spend a lot more time at 10% damage, and versus fairly low-level enemies, 10% damage doesn't do that much, right? You know, it's 1/10 of your damage. You would do 10 times more damage at fully ramped up, right? So it made a pretty significant difference even at fairly low-level enemies, and so I'm really glad that they have changed this the way they have. There's some other changes that I would have done. I did a little video where I proposed just giving them a long ramp up that's not per target. I actually kind of like this better than what my initial suggestion was because it does make them different from machine guns and whatnot, right? They ramp up in a different way. And I think that's kind of cool. And with the faster ramp up time now, it doesn't feel too onerous. Another thing that's nice is that they changed the Amprex, right? It has been dropped down to 22 base damage from 24, which might not sound that significant, except that you have to remember that 20% of the Amprex's old base damage would have been 2.4 damage. So that's a pretty substantial decrease in its overall base damage, which was really needed because it was by far and away the best beam weapon, right, before the change. That change that happened today, just an hour before I started recording this video. And as you'll see here, the Amprex is still quite good. Actually, this is shoot, I always forget to switch off of this. This is a gas damage build. It's actually pretty bad for this level of enemies. But eventually, especially if I start headshotting them, I'm going to be able to chew through these, right? So it's still good, even if you use the wrong element type on high-level enemies. If I go swap onto corrosive and take out another group of these guys, it's going to work a lot better. One thing that's really nice is that the Amprex, what do they change about it? They increased the arc range, right, for its increased the arcing range for its chain lightning effect, right? I think it was from 7 meters to 12 meters range, which is actually pretty substantial. So you can arc between enemies that are quite far apart, and it makes it still probably one of the best beam weapons, but the gap between the Amprex and the Phage and the Synapse has been closed significantly, right? And it's possibly even some of the secondary beam weapons are going to be a lot better now, and I've seen people do some pretty crazy things with weird secondary beam weapons, right? Of particular note is the Atomos, which I thought was like almost as good as the Amprex and a little bit overpowered, was buffed with a larger chaining distance this update, and no other changes. So let's bring that out. I think the Atomos is probably on the overtuned side, but I can't complain too much because I do enjoy this weapon quite a bit myself. So I've got this blast corrosive build, right? And let's just swap this out. Let's reset these guys. Let's take a look at how the Atomos does, not the Amprex. Right? It doesn't deal as much like hardcore damage right off the bat, especially because it's not really a crit weapon, so you can't really use it super well with Hunter's Munitions. But if you keep firing it, guys, you're going to get a lot of corrosive procs over time, and you will be able to take down these high-level enemies, right? And with the attack chains between 5 enemies, you get pretty substantial damage, especially with a bit of punch through. And pretty substantial AoE for status procs. So it's a pretty nice weapon to take into high-level missions. The damage is, noticeably slower at killing enemies than the Amprex is. So without a damage boost, you can't quite keep up at very high levels. Like we bump these guys up to level 150 or 180, but it's not too bad before then. It's a very, very good beam weapon. It's not as standout as it used to be, which I think is a good thing, because, of course, weapons like the Synapse have been buffed. I guess the one other thing I wanted to show off was the Phage. The Phage had a pretty significant buff. I'm not 100% sure it needed. I am using a Riven for this. The Phage is on a little bit on the needing a Riven side of things, right? In terms of overall power level, so I guess that does kind of justify the buffs. It now starts at 70% of your base damage, right? So it has a much smaller total amount to ramp up. So we started on these guys, right? You'll see it ramp up pretty quickly to around 1,000 damage, and then it wasn't ticking that much higher for a bit because it took a while for corrosive procs to get it to actually go higher, right? And so the Phage is kind of nice. I like it a lot. It's got this high base damage kind of thing going on that's been accentuated by the update that makes it start at a higher percentage of its total damage when it begins ramping up, right? Making the ramp up much less of an issue for it, and making it a good room sweeper weapon. Overall, let's see, what else did they change? I think they gave a lot better, I think the word for it would be characterization to the different beam weapons, right? The overall changes made the Synapse much better at just killing single guys, right? And it made killing single guys more of a viable strat, right? Oh, the Synapse was also buffed from 18 to 20 base damage, and the range was increased from 20 to 27. So pretty substantial buffs for the Synapse. I think that's going to be a very fun weapon to use going forward with those changes, right? And so the Synapse is going to be a lot better, and that whole style of burning down one enemy at a time or 2 enemies at a time that it does with just basically a laser pointer of death, that really is helped out by these changes. The Convectrix also got a big improvement in that its primary fire starts at 60% base damage, and its alt fire starts at 80% base damage. Also, with the new decay mechanic for the scaling damage, your Convectrix is going to be able to actually do full damage sometimes, right, with the alt fire. Because if you primary fire and sweep a group of enemies slowly, right, you can probably hit 5 guys and spend 0.4 seconds on each guy, and then you alt fire and you're going to hit them all for 90% of your total damage, right? Because the damage ramps up and doesn't start ramping down, remember, for 0.8 seconds. So you actually have a pretty good ability to shoot across a group of enemies, or maybe pincer them a couple times and actually have some damage build up from the time you spend shooting them, even if it's small fractions of a second at a time, right? As long as you keep tagging enemies, you can kind of build it up on them. I think that's all I really wanted to talk about for beam weapons. In my opinion, this change is fantastic. I think they really hit the nail on the head this time from the testing I've done so far in terms of making beam weapons feel good, actually be useful and powerful, and the nerfs to the Amprex were well-deserved, although I do, as much as I enjoy it, it's still a very effective weapon, and it was a bit over the top before this, so I was happy to see that as well. And I think we'll have to see if the weapons like the Convectrix do actually end up being pretty usable. But I think overall the majority of beam weapons are now quite good, even without a Riven. And some of the worst ones, you know, if you snag a Riven for them, they can be pretty solid. So yeah, there's a lot of other stuff to look at in this update, but I wanted to make just one video about beam weapons. So that's like my final verdict, right? Beam weapons are great now, and they're not just great, they actually feel good to use instead of feeling really shitty to use, which is kind of how they were until this update just now. So that's all for now, and if you enjoyed this video and you'll want to see more of it, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me out. And thank you for watching. Yakri out.